Hello everyone, welcome back to the Crash MotoGP podcast. And we're not going to talk about 2026 because that's boring. We're going to talk about 2027 already. And it's December the 8th, 2025. So we're getting ahead of schedule, but the market will change a lot, especially with the riders next year. But we've got some 2027 news, and KTM are the first to show off their new bike, their 850cc. Pete and Lewis joined me, Jordan Morland, to discuss it. Pete, what do you make of it? It was very short. Obviously, not going to give massive things away, but KTM have now been the first to announce that their engine's running. They've given a video of it on track. The timeline's kind of fitting, isn't it? Teams are cracking on straight away as soon as the sort of ban lifted on testing.
Yeah, that's it. It's a show of intent, isn't it? The KTM are making clear that they are pushing forward with their 850cc project. No manufacturers, of course, are technically signed up for the next contract cycle yet. So we're still in this sort of middle ground of people going forward with development, but not officially signed up for the next cycle of rules. But KTM, obviously, with all the uncertainty that there's been with the last winter and everything else, or the financial situation, they want to get out there early, show some stability, and it's sort of a very KTM thing, isn't it? In other motorsport arenas and rule changes, they always like to get out there first, show that they're sort of on the ball, ahead of the game, however you want to phrase it. And I think that's what it was about, wasn't it? It's just showing that they have a project already up and running. So this is they made solid progress with it. They are on course. Even with, as you say, still over a year to go of development still. So we've got to wait and see. The Pirelli tyres obviously were tested after Misano in September for the first time with 1,000cc bikes. We don't know. There was no information from Pole's Instagram, which is where this video came out, was there? But it's certainly possible that they're using the Pirellis. Pirelli have said they'll sort of back the manufacturers in any private tests that they want to do with their 850cc bikes, rather than sort of do big group tests. They'll just sort of go where the manufacturers want to go on their normal test tracks. So I think we'll see KTM are first, as you say, and we'll see sort of a steady stream of the others slotting in with their sort of debut of their machines for next year in various stages, whether it's just an engine in this year's bike or a completely new sort of early prototype. I think we'll see a full range of things, and development will continue. We're sort of starting to hear, aren't we, that maybe from around April next year, teams and factories will sort of switch pretty much fully to the 850s. So at the moment, it'll be sort of developing the 26 bikes along with the very early version of the 27s.
Yeah, Lewis, what do you make of it? I mean, it's I can imagine that most manufacturers are on the same sort of timeline as KTM. I don't know if they're as urgently wanting to get it out there, but even seeing stuff in the Italian press with Ducati, apparently they're ready to go, essentially. As Pete says, April could be when we potentially see Ducati's first outing on the 27s.
Yeah, I think from KTM's perspective, this is probably aimed at the investors and the new owners to be like, look, we need, because KTM still is in some financial uncertainty. There has been still some turbulent times. It's not quite been as publicly broadcast as maybe the initial crisis was this time last year, but I think KTM are very much with the video they released a few weeks ago of the engine firing up, and now this clip. It's very rare that a team would be so open about, look at this top secret thing we've already put on track. It's very unusual, and for me, it's not necessarily KTM going, throwing down the gauntlet. It's KTM, I think, fighting to ensure that it has a future in MotoGP. It's, basically to the investors, to the new owners, we've already put the capital into developing this engine. We're already quite far down the road, so let's keep the faith in the project and let's keep going. So I think it was that more than anything, more than a warning to its rivals, more than anything, I think it was very much KTM's kind of a signal to within, really, to continue to back this project. I think other manufacturers, when we see those engines, likely they will want to put a proper bike on track rather than a lab bike, rather than just the engine. We know because of the limited time of the Pirelli tyres so far, they needed the two tests that were scheduled for from September to November on the Pirelli rubber to basically get all the information they need to finally build a chassis. And it's one thing that Aprilia told us back at Misano, was that they haven't been able to build a chassis yet because they haven't had the data from the Pirelli tyres to do that. So I think when we talk about timelines for Ducati, for Honda, when we're here in sort of April time, I think those manufacturers want to put a full bike on track, or at very least a very beginner spec of the 2027 bike, chassis, everything aero, rather than just engine on its own. Because as we know, aero affects engine performance. You know, if you're running old aero, which we know these current bikes got big aero, big drag. If you're trying to test a new engine, you're not going to quite get out of that what you need. Obviously, they're not using ride height devices, but these are bikes developed around ride height devices. So the ride and the way that all the forces and everything that go through the engine is maybe not representative. So I think these other manufacturers who are, let's say, a bit more financially secure in their future will want to put a full bike on track first to begin development that way. Whereas for me, like I say, I think KTM, this is very much a statement to KTM's board, KTM's owners, KTM's investors that, you know, we're still afloat here, so don't give up on us.
Yeah, it's a fair point. And Pete, Lewis talks about obviously the aeros and stuff will change, and when we see the complete packages, it'll look very different. I mean, we don't know what Ducati are doing. I mean, our Ducati teases maybe at Misano test with new aero potentially that they didn't even run at Valencia. So what are they planning here? Are they letting little bits out? But how do you think the new bikes will perform compared to the ones we have now? I mean, is it going to be a complete throwback to, say, 2017, for example, 2018? Are we going to go back to that sort of era, or do you think it'll be on the limit, like Casey Stoner says, with dirty arrows and stuff? Is it going to be a big jump?
I think the first thing you could say is, as far as what the bikes will be like, is interesting that they kept the sound on the KTM clip, wasn't it? Because you can be sure the other factories, they'll be able to analyze that, break it down, look for the firing orders, the space between it and everything else. So normally you only get pictures. So interesting that they did put out a full video with sound. You know, they didn't put music over it. They left it as it was and everything else. And as I say, other manufacturers will be interested in that, just to see if KTM tweaked with the compared to their engine they're running now, and maybe why. But of course, this might not be the only engine that KTM has. They might have several versions of an 850. So, and then as far as the performance, it's interesting with the Pirelli tyres, isn't it? It's a chicken and egg thing. On the one hand, the manufacturers need the Pirelli tyres. On the other hand, I spoke to Pirelli at Valencia, and they were saying, look, there wasn't much point in doing another test until the manufacturers had 850 bikes ready to run. So, both sides sort of are waiting for the other a little bit. And KTM have obviously, they've said, well, we're ready with a bike. And so Pirelli will say, well, here's our initial tyres then, and you go out. And then that's sort of got the ball rolling. So we don't have any lap times. We don't know. No one's been, giving away what the performance is like relative to the tyres that we have now. Ultimately, I think you're probably looking at a couple of seconds a lap difference. I think it will be, the engines will be smaller, but as always, they'll find another way around. Corner speeds might be higher. There'll be less aerodynamics, but then the bikes might be quicker on the straights in top speed if there's less drag, as Lewis was saying about balancing the. So we don't quite know how that balance will play out. And certainly at the start, there'll be teams that go one or the other. One team might go quite aero heavy and think that's the way to get the overall lap time. Another might go light. And then in the end, as always happens, they'll sort of converge on the right balance between it, won't they? Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see as, we look ahead to the rider market, who gets it right first. That's going to be the key. Everyone's going to make their best guess and they're going to have their prototypes, but naturally, some are going to get it right more than others. It's just the way it is, isn't it? Someone's going to get an advantage, and it's a case of how long will that advantage last, and who happens to be on those bikes that start off the strongest, I suppose.
Yeah, on that, we'll get straight into it. Pete touched on the rider market. Now, it will change dramatically. I think, personally predicting it will be very early. We'll get a lot of movement. I've kind of got 4 riders down here that I think are the centerpieces of it. Now, I was going to add Marc Marquez in, but I do think he's going to remain with Ducati for 2027. So, I mean, there's no change there. He's just going to stay. But who knows? There could be something surprising. He might decide to move, but I don't think he will. 4 riders are Fabio Quartararo, Pedro Acosta, Pecco Bagnaia, and Jorge Martin. Now, Lewis, we'll start with Acosta because it's kind of touched on KTM there. I mean, he's going to be like, oh, at least I know the bike's kind of on track and I've kind of seen it. I've heard things from test riders. Is he going to stay at KTM for one more year after this 2026 season, or is it time for him to go to the marquee factory like Ducati, for example?
I think the problem riders are going to have this year is that they can't. They're going to have to commit to a multi-year deal because manufacturers don't like being out of sync. But other manufacturers aren't really, if they've got someone in mind they want to sign, they're not going to sort of dangle a 1 year in front of them, or a 1+1 based on, performance and whatever, on the off chance that then they could snag, someone like Pedro Acosta, for example, for 2028. I think with a new rule cycle, you need stability throughout it. So I basically, whatever decision you make is the decision. So whatever Acosta does, he's going to have to commit to it for 2 years. Whether that's KTM or not is really the question. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, that we still don't really know what KTM's future looks like. We don't know if they are going to be on the grid in 2027. They've put the investment in to get the project off the ground, but that doesn't mean it will happen. We've seen manufacturers build engines that don't race and build bikes that don't race. I'm sure Suzuki probably had, we know for example Suzuki had things in the works for 2023 before it decided that it was going to pull the plug. So you think back to when we went to the 800cc's, for example, the last couple of races of 2006, we had an Elmore engine on the grid, which whatever happened to that project. Just because you put the investment in is not a guarantee. And as Pete's rightly pointed out as well, nobody's officially committed to 2027. And you do have to kind of ask the question, if KTM carries on with uncertainty, financial uncertainty, Dorna has kind of got a bit of a dilemma on its hands of, does it want itself to commit to a manufacturer that maybe can't see out a full rule cycle? Because that's not a good look for a championship, to lose a manufacturer partway through a new rule cycle. It makes it look like either the new rules don't work or they're too expensive or, whatever. And then it leaves a big problem. KTM puts 4 bikes on the grid currently. And, that's, there are lots of questions to get there first. And I think, again, going back to KTM's test, part of that probably was it going to Pedro Acosta. Look, you can trust us. You can commit your future to us. We're ahead of the curve already. We're going to be there in 27. We're going to be there for you. So come, stay with us and let's complete this journey together. Acosta's a funny one in terms of, I think we got 2 versions of Acosta this year. For the first half of the year, I thought we got for the first time, he was very obviously very young in his career. I think after his rookie season, we kind of got the impression, wow, this kid's really mature for his age. And everyone around him, I've spoken to Aki Ayo, I've spoken to Paul Truathan, I know you have as well, Pete, that they've all said the same thing all the way up the rankings, that Pedro's this really mature character. But I thought for the first half of 2025, we really saw that immaturity come through, particularly when we got to Silverstone and he was talking about, they need to do things, I don't have time to wait. And then we got to Aragon and someone asked him, are you expecting anything? And he said, look, they've had 12 days. If they need longer than that, then, what's going on here? They should be doing things. And I think then in the second half of the season, and obviously all the comments, KTM sat down with him and said, look, this doesn't help. This doesn't help you. It doesn't help us. Be a bit more considerate. And in the second half of the season, we got there with Pedro, where he was much more, okay, we're trying our best, really proud of the guys, we're doing this, we're doing that, it's race by race. We've got weaknesses, but we're working, etc., etc. So because of that, it's quite hard to know where his brain's at. This is really obviously a rider that wants to win. He doesn't feel like he can wait for some reason. I don't know why a 21-year-old thinks that he, that the end of his career is just round the corner. But he wants something to win, but the problem is he's going to command a very high market value. That's for sure, and he and his management know that. So instantly, that already rules Ducati off the board as far as I'm concerned, because they have to stump up the capital for Marc Marquez. That's already very evidently the priority for Ducati, is get Marquez on a contract and then work the rest out from there. So then that removes the best bike off the grid there for Pedro Acosta. So then you look at the other manufacturers that have possible bikes. Honda's maybe the most obvious one in terms of links, in terms of, that has the factory kind of clout behind it. Honda's going to be a big player in this. We know that they're going to be in there for Jorge Martin. They're probably definitely going to be in there for Pedro Acosta. They will shop around. There are, Fabio Quartararo's name's been linked there as well. They know they've got a good foundation. They've got the money. They can offer a lot. So you kind of view, where does Pedro Acosta, KTM sticking with what he knows if they can convince him. Honda, if he's going to step away. I don't think Aprilia's really got the money to put a big name right, especially after what's happened with Jorge Martin this year. I think Aprilia for a few years now will be quite reluctant to put the money behind for a big name rider in case it doesn't work. Kind of similar to Ducati, really, when they signed Jorge Lorenzo and it didn't really work out. They made the decision to jump early, and then afterwards they started scaling back those contracts. And then when COVID came along as well, they really pulled back on those contract sums. Then you look at, who else you got in the grid? Yamaha. Yamaha's market value is super, super low at this point, and it's hard to imagine them emerging in the second half. By the time that all these contracts are going to be sorted for the big name riders, that Yamaha will have put a bike on the grid that could convince anyone to commit 2 years that they can in a couple of years fight for a championship. So I would argue really Acosta's only options are KTM or Honda. And when you're in that sort of situation, do you kind of go with what you know? He stays at KTM. He's going to have the might of KTM behind him. He knows anything he says they'll do, but there is just that question mark of what are KTM capable of doing under their current situation, and is that going to get worse over the next few years if Bajaj Auto decides, well, actually, we're not doing as well as we thought here. We're maybe going to have to clamp down on the racing program. But a decision's going to have to be made soon for a rider like Acosta, and he's either going to have to go with what he knows that KTM have got a decent package right now, but they're still a bit away from getting to where they need to be. Yeah. Or do you take a risk and go with a Honda who's developing, but they're going into next year with no concessions? So now they're going to have to really dig in deep, and we haven't seen what Honda's capable of yet in that situation when they can't just throw a new engine at it, take a day of testing with his riders and figure something out. They've got to work a bit harder. So I think that's going to be a real interesting kind of few months for Acosta. Does he think he can get on better somewhere else, or does he suck it up for another couple of years and hope that with his crew, with the manufacturer he knows, with a bike that he knows, that and the jump that KTM's already gotten on 850 regulations, that he can commit to that?
It's interesting with them because you talk about market value, and Pete, I want to bring you in on this, just the other angle. Does he look, I can't keep using this, but does he look at Marc Marquez for 23, for example, and think, I could take a pay cut and I'll go on a Ducati on a satellite team for a year? Because we know Lewis is right, the reluctancy to put a rider into the factory team straight away is quite, it's been going on for about 5-6 years really now when you think about it. They don't commit to the rider, but could that be the avenue they could look at? Just, he wants to be with Gigi, he wants to be in that Ducati environment, because it is a lottery, but he just wants to go with the guys who've been doing it for the past how many years?
I think you do get the impression, and what you hear from the people around him is that he's not money motivated. Let's say he's not going to be interested in where do I have the biggest pay packet in MotoGP. He wants to fight for the championship, and Lewis is quite right, bringing up the frustration that we saw at the start of the year and everything else. I think that illustrates that. So I do think you're right there, Jordan, that he will be looking first and foremost, what's the most competitive package I can get. And then it will be, which, as we've said, though, is a huge gamble in trying to decide that or trying to pick it with so many unknowns in place. I think KTM will have a fight to keep him, just because he's going to want those assurances, about the reasons that Lewis said about them continuing to race, and probably coming back to no manufacturers being signed up yet. KTM probably more than any of the others are going to want to sort of get that deal done, aren't they? We know that there's all discussions where you hear things like the Concord agreement with Formula One and these kind of things being brought up. So we don't really know exactly how far apart the manufacturers in Dorna are at the moment. But I think of all the manufacturers, KTM will want that across the line first in order to get that sort of ticked off.
I just wanted to come in there on the satellite Ducati thing as well. Is that look at the problems that it kind of caused Ducati when they did bring Mark in, and then it came to this year and what they did.
Deciding, yeah.
Part of me thinks that Ducati would be quite reluctant to do that again because, you know, it cost them the world champion, and at the end of this year, they must be looking back at that and thinking, what could he have done on the same spec bike as Mark, considering what Pecco did on the bike? So I think there's going to be an element of that involved as well, is that Ducati might well be quite reluctant to.
And it's also because you're not going in on satellite or year-old machinery, you're going in on the same machine essentially. Yes, the factory will have the best pieces of the newer bikes, but you're going in, everyone's got to have the same, and I think that's another element. Would you want that Martin situation again where you're having a satellite team fight for a world title, and you had Ducati, or discussed it before? That's a headache in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, and you have to ask this question as well. Does Pedro Acosta think he can beat Mark on equal machinery? Because that's what that would come down to as well, is do you feel confident enough to go up against a guy that absolutely dominated on the same bike? His current teammates have proven that that's not easy at any point in their career. You know, does Pedro have the hubris to believe that he can do that? But probably. He's a very motivated, very fiery young man, but there is that element of, do you think you can do it on the same bike, or do you go in a different direction because that's the only way? Looking at maybe someone like Marco Bezzecchi and Aprilia right now, or even a few years ago Ducati Dovizioso, thinking, you know, can we do something different to get to the same level?
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. Pete, do you want to finish off?
I was just going to say, so we can probably guess most factories will want to keep one rider, either
one rider,
from
the
factory team already, or from a satellite team. You know, someone who knows the bike, just for that continuity, won't they? So really, what we're talking about is probably only one seat on each of them. The five factories, KTM being the biggest unknown, as we've said there, but potentially only one seat available. I think on the other side of the coin, bringing up the Gresini example and Marquez, there is a possibility that if Ducati didn't pick Acosta, you've got the risk of, what if someone else has him and we then have to race against him? You know, if they do rate him highly, and then you also have the kind of the Gresini situation where Mark was doing the deal with Gresini, and you know, you're kind of, well, if Acosta did VR46, you know, we've had a lot of links about that. If he was, let's imagine, if he was saying, look, I just want to be on the bike and I do want to measure myself against Marc Marquez, you know, let's say that he does want to do that, you know, what if he just said, okay, there's no seat at the factory team, but VR46 would love to have me. They, you know, we've already had discussions, etc. So that, you know, what happens then? Do they then turn down a rider who is recognized even by Marc Marquez as one of the, you know, the rising talents? So it's an interesting one. Do you then lose him and risk racing against him if you're Ducati? You know, and ultimately we know that was kind of one of the reasons why they accepted Mark at Gresini, wasn't it? So they said, was because, and then into the factory team, because they didn't want to lose it, you know, and be racing against him. So it all comes down to how they, you know, what their options are, how they view Acosta as a rider versus the guys they've got, and they are in that position of having, we assume, Marc Marquez staying on, so that gives them a massive, you know, advantage in that regard. They got the continuity, they've got, you know, the reigning champion, and could well be a 10-time world champion by then as well. So I think of all the manufacturers, rider-wise, they're in the most comfortable situation, and of course they have the most bikes as well. So they do have more options if they want to get a rider on board. As you've quite rightly said, when they sign new riders now, they tend to put them in satellite teams just to see if they really do gel with the bike. So it wouldn't be a shock thing, and I think Acosta would be open to it. You know, if they said, look, you'll have equal machinery, you'll be on a factory spec bike, equal updates, I don't think the money, anything like that, would be a bigger obstacle for him, if that makes sense.
No, you're right. And I think we can factor in Fabio Quartararo to that, Lewis, too. He's kind of in a similar mode. Obviously, he comes with a lot more, I mean, he's a MotoGP world champion, but I kind of view him and Pedro as they're like the, oh, look at this, we're going to nab these two sort of thing. If you put the right price in front of them, not even the right price, it's the right package and deal. Quartararo, I mean, I think we're all I think we are. It's fairly that it looks like he's going to leave Yamaha. I mean, just from what he said, I mean, unless that bike is a massive jump from where it's been, even in pre-season testing. I think that he wants something new. His options are kind of like Acosta's, aren't they? He kind of has to look at potentially, is it Honda, Ducati? Would they really want to bring in someone who's on a high wage? Would he have to take a massive cut? It's similar, isn't it? But it's different.
Yeah, I think with Fabio Quartararo, it's gone as far as it can at Yamaha, and I think for both parties, really, the best scenario here is that they do part ways. I think Yamaha, for the good of its future, I think needs to move beyond Fabio, because if it is to re-sign him again, it's going to have to be on a similar contract, of which, they're spending a lot of money right now to have a satellite team, to develop a V4, to develop an 850, to, and they're not really going very far forward at the moment, and they can't really risk more friction with Quartararo going into a new rule cycle, because they've been here before with Maverick Vinales, and that situation ended badly for everyone, really. But it is a strain on a team, and when sometimes it is good just to end things where they are and move on and be grateful for what's happened up to that point and start again. I think Fabio is slightly more within his rights to be a bit more urgent about winning than Pedro Acosta, I think, because this is a world champion. This is a rider that came into MotoGP, was straight away able to fight for race wins, fought for a championship in year 2, won the championship in year 3, very nearly won a championship in year 4 on an inferior bike. This is a rider that is at the level already and is now really should be at this stage well into the real crest of his career, really, where he is performing at his absolute best. And Yamaha has squandered that potential over the past 4 years. Whether you can, blame him, he shouldn't have signed, blah, 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 chose the money, etc., etc. I think at the time he signed, you can understand why. He was convinced by Max Bartolini. He wasn't convinced at the time by Aprilia, which, to be fair, at the point he signed that Yamaha contract, had only won 4 Grand Prix in, 10 years since it had come back to MotoGP. It's not a great sort of success rate. The inconsistency was still there, and obviously the success he'd had with Yamaha in the past. I feel like you can understand that. I think the Marquez Grassini thing is kind of begun to cloud people's judgment a bit, of like, oh well, it's anyone should just take a competitive ride, and it's like, well, actually, those are very, very different scenarios. Mark was
100%.
at a point where he was coming off injury, but was also at a point where, from the outside, it was easy to see that the Honda was uncompetitive, but from his own perspective, he's ridden uncompetitive bikes before and been successful, and he couldn't on this occasion. And as we've heard a lot of recently, he was very, very unsure of himself and very unsure that his career could continue. So the Grassini thing had to happen for him to. It was a last throw of the dice. I think everyone kind of was lulled in, oh, Marquez on a Ducati, after that first test, he's going to walk it, it's going to be fine. But I think people forget that it really was, that was it. If it didn't work, there was not really any coming back from that. So they're very, very different situations. And going back to the Pedro thing as well, I think kind of using that Mark example is maybe unfair, because, again, that was a rider who'd achieved everything already.
Yeah.
And was trying to kind of ensure that he had a few years left in his career, whereas these are riders that still have time. And yeah, they're not in a position to go, okay, well, I need to go and take something completely off the board and, take the risk that Marquez did, because in a sense they don't need to. Quartararo has proven, even on rubbish Yamaha bikes, that he is still the best Yamaha rider and one of the best on the grid. Pedro Acosta has proved that at KTM as well. So these are riders that will command bigger and better things. From Quartararo's point of view, I mean, he needs something he can be competitive on straight away. I think Ducati is probably out of the question there. I think the problem Ducati have got is that they sign Mark. Great. If Pecco picks up again,
what do you do then?
Ducati would want to keep him because he's a double world champion on their bike, and I think Pecco is smart enough to know that if his results do rebound a bit next year, he isn't going to be able to command as big a salary as he has currently because of what happened this year. But I think fundamentally he would rather stick with Ducati and be successful there than take a risk elsewhere. Alex Marquez will be happy to stay at Gresini on factory bike, so long as I think he gets a Ducati contract rather than the Gresini one. They've got Fermin Aldeguer, who, again, if they put onto a factory bike at Gresini, I'm sure would probably be quite happy with that and competitive. And then VR46 is sort of whatever VR46 wants to do, really. They can keep the riders they have. They can, if they wanted to promote Celestino Vietti for whatever reason. We think, obviously, one of those seats has to be earmarked for Nicolo Bulliga, and it makes sense that it would be VR46 of all of them. So, from that perspective, Ducati kind of only has one seat available, if you think about it.
And it's a seat that's really, as you say, it's... Well, Bagnaia, I mean, the way he was speaking, I think he talked about it in Valencia, didn't he? They want to start contract negotiations, even after the tough season. So
yeah, he says he wants to be. He always considered himself a Ducati rider for life, and I believe that. Like I genuinely believe that. So it's hard to see Quartararo fitting into that. Again, Honda links there make sense. I just can't shake the Aprilia sort of links between it happened before.
This is my thinking, and this is where I want to bring in Pete and bring in Jorge Martin on this one too. Pete, what do you think about this? Because in my head, I don't know where it came from. I just seem to think that Martin will end up at Yamaha and the Quartararo will end up at Aprilia as a sort of swap deal. Do you think that makes sense?
Well, again, if we come back to the one rider, one factory that they want to keep, Bez is the obvious guy, isn't it? And we can we're all assuming that, but I'll just say it anyway. So that, again, leaves that one seat, doesn't it? Which is Jorge Martin's at the moment. And that's where I think this whole contract riff from earlier this year could be quite damaging, couldn't it? You know, there was a lot that went wrong for Martin this year that really wasn't in his hands, just bad luck with his accidents and, you know, getting hit in guitar, things like that. But that was a moment where, you know, he would have had the final call on that. You know, yes, he's got management, yes, he's got people around him, but ultimately, and I think Marc Marquez said this about the Honda move, that the rider makes the final decision. And I think, you know, all of that sort of controversy, the kind of the bad atmosphere that was created by that, everything else, that's all going to factor into the negotiations for next year, isn't it? And for a bike that has been right up there, challenging to be the best at the end of this year. Now we have to wait and see next year what it'll do. Obviously, as we've said, 850s is a new era again, so we don't know. But still, if Aprilia picks up where they'd left off this year, they're not going to be short of riders looking very closely at that bike and wanting to be on it. So, yeah, in which case, Jorge Martin hasn't helped himself, has he, with the whole contract situation? Quartararo was speaking to them, you know, so we know that there's avenues there. And if he wants a competitive bike and he can't get a Ducati, then if you follow the hierarchy of this year, then the Aprilia is the sort of logical choice. I suppose I would just throw this out there for Yamaha, and that is that we don't know quite how the engine freeze is going to work, but let's assume it carries on like it is and they're in D concessions. That would mean that they can develop their 850 engine during the first year and the others would be frozen. I assume that will continue, though. That would be a major perk, you know, if you're you know, in a new era, as we've said, where there's lots of different things that'll be tried, maybe different firing intervals, all that kind of stuff. The fact that you could develop your engine, we haven't got the 2027 rules yet, but assuming that the freeze will continue as let's say the season by season freeze I'm talking about here, of course, you know, the other manufacturers that are not in D concessions, if we assume Yamaha will still be in D, would freeze their engines for the start of the 850 era. If they still have that, then that's going to be quite a perk, I think, for given all of the, you know, the access to testing as well as everything else. I suppose we should just say that who have they got? We've got riders signed for 27 at the moment. Toprak, isn't it? So they've got one rider already signed. Who are the others? You've got Zarco and Diogo Moreira at Honda, haven't they? Yeah. They've got a deal, and Aldeguer's got an option, isn't he? I think for another 2 years. That's on Ducati's side, and you know, given the rookie year he's had, that's pretty much going to be taken. So those are the four guys that we know are going to be on the 2027 grid so far, and yeah, Quartararo is certainly one of the big names to fall into place.
Just to play devil's advocate on that one, is that Ducati Yamaha being the only one that has concessions to freely develop engines this year. could also be viewed as a bit of a negative, because if they've got to develop this V4 project and make it competitive while also because they have to make the V4 project now competitive to make the 850 competitive.
Yeah,
so they're going to be doing quite a lot that diverts resources. And I would find it hard that any manufacturer, all manufacturers would agree on anyone being allowed free engine development next year for a new rule cycle. I think there must be a grace period there where the regulations will be okay. Everyone's in the concession A, for example, and then we'll figure it out from that point.
Yeah,
because if there are any issues, then
let's see. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. Yeah, because there's nothing at the moment. So yeah, we'll see.
But it's a good point, and those are just the kind of the Yamaha things that Fabio has to weigh up, because it's like, okay, they're putting the V4 out there. They've obviously got Toprak for developing the 850 on Pirelli tires. So Ducati and Yamaha have an advantage that others don't right now, in that they've got riders that know those tires, and therefore that's unlocking the potential of those tires is going to be something that will be really key to, at the very least, early success in 2027. So I guess that's something that he has to weigh up there as well. However, if you're Fabio Quartararo and you've launched Aprilia this year, knowing that you turned down that bike, you're probably looking at someone like Marco Bezzecchi and going, okay, if he can do that on that bike, I'm a better rider than him, so I can take the fight to Mark. Those races where Bez lost against Mark, I'm winning those races. I would imagine would be the thought process there. So, we know the Aprilia is very rider friendly, very, very good in the corners, very agile, but very good on braking as well, which are two things that Fabio Quartararo, that's where he excels, is the hard braking, corner speed. It does seem like it's a bike that's made for him, and it's hard to see Aprilia dropping the ball going into the 850s, because they've done the thing that you need to do to go into a new rule cycle, which is maintain your strong points, but figure out how to fix your weak points, which was always those hard break-ins. And really, as we've talked about, the 850s, a bit smaller, the overall engine characteristics makeup are not altogether that different from the current engine. So in theory, Aprilia should be able to apply what it's applied now with the current bike to the 850s and not really mess around with the package very much, which if I was Fabio Quartararo, would be attractive to me personally. A bike that looks like you could ride it, be competitive on, has the potential to fight with Ducati, but yeah, as we've talked about, these are a lottery, do you throw your eggs in the Honda basket?
Yeah.
It seems like Honda's already sounded out the fact that Martin and Acosta look kind of like the favourites. That's clearly where they're looking at the moment. Yamaha's a tricky one as well, because I think the problem we've got with Yamaha is that clearly both sides are tense with each other, but it seems like over the past few weeks, Yamaha's gotten a bit more brave.
Punchy, yeah. And
part of me thinks that's because they've become a bit emboldened by the fact that they've got Toprak now signed. So they can... It sort of seems to be that Yamaha management feels like they can be a bit more aggressive with Fabio because they've got another potential superstar on their hands in Toprak, who, in theory, once we get to 27 on the Pirelli tyres, should take quite a significant step forward. But, so that's the thing there. But the thing Yamaha needs to be careful of is the fact that if it loses Fabio, they're not going to get a like-for-like replacement, because who wants to ride a Yamaha right now? Even with 27 and Toprak on the bike and that advantage there and the V4, and you look at his rider lineup this year, Jack Miller was a rider that was very nearly out the paddock when he signed that contract, was saved because of his passport. Miguel Oliveira was a rider that was kind of on his way out the paddock, got saved because there was a bit of influence there from the Portuguese Grand Prix. You got Alex Rins, who's not, I don't think is ever going to be back at the level that we saw Alex. So who do you get to replace him? They haven't really been able to convince many big name riders to throw their lot in with Yamaha, and you're going to essentially be looking at a situation where Yamaha's rider lineup next year, if they don't have Fabio, is going to be made up of midfield, riders that were maybe kicked out of better rides or lost whatever, and that's going to hold things back as well. they don't really have they don't have many sort of young superstars on their books in the same way that Honda had Morera and Ducati have had Aldeguer, and that's the thing Yamaha has to be wary of as well, is that it can play that game with Fabio if it wants, but it then has to be wary that it's going into a very unfavourable rider market.
Yeah, well, this is where we bring in Pete, and we bring in again Jorge Martin, and potentially there. Pete, we discussed previously many times about this Honda stuff with Martin, and that was messy. Manager saying, "Oh yeah, we're in contact with Honda," and then that created a whole thing. How do you think Honda view that in the terms of Martin for the future? Because the Aprilia stuff's been really damaging, hasn't it? That mid-season stuff wasn't great to look for anyone involved in it. I mean, Aprilia handled it the best, and they convinced them that this is the project. But put it this way, are Aprilia going to want to commit to Martin? If he has a really good 26, potentially, but they'll say to him, listen, if you get beat by Bezzecchi again, you're not getting the wages you're getting. You're on a lower deal. Bezzecchi's the guy. Would Martin take that as a hit to the ego, thinking, well, I'm the world champion from 2 years? Would he want to then go, I'm going to go to another factory and say Honda, go, listen, mate, the way you acted last year, we're not having that, because if you don't do Aprilia, you could do it to us and we're not going to take it. Would he then have to go to the Yamaha, being like, well, I could come here and try and build a project? Is that a viable option, do you think?
Well, and a Pramac Yamaha, maybe, of course, go back to the team that he won the World Championship with. I mean, if he's looking to go back to, let's say, a team he knows and that atmosphere and everything else he's been so successful with, then there's a Yamaha there. Yamaha are quite keen on stressing, aren't they, that we have 4 factory bikes, 4 factory riders. That was how they got Top Rack into the team, rather than going for the full factory sort of deal that we'd heard he'd always wanted. But I think the other interesting thing about talking about the riders coming in and everything else is, will teams look more towards their superbike projects? And I'm thinking of Yamaha here as we're talking about them. Given the Pirelli link, will that suddenly open the door maybe to riders coming from superbike with that knowledge?
Locatelli, Vierge, who knows? That's a good point.
Potentially, yeah. Maybe if you put them on the bike, it all depends on how the MotoGP riders react to the Pirelli tyres, how different they are. I mean, that also extends to, I think it was, I spoke to Silvan Guintoli, and he was pointing out, look, when these tyres change, maybe the V4 won't be a dominant sort of engine configuration. Now, it would be a major step for a manufacturer to go back, and obviously Yamaha, but that's how different this change is of the tyre. Everyone's gone to the V4 to make the most out of the Michelin rear kind of thing, and put more weight on the rear tyre, everything else. Well, if the Pirelli tyre doesn't have that, or is a more balanced design, then suddenly another type, but the inline might suddenly come back into sort of fashion again. So, I mean, that's how open it will be with these tyres. Now, it would be a huge expense. Obviously, we're talking there about developing 2 different bikes alongside. But who knows? If there's a manufacturer out there, if Honda literally wanted to throw a blank check at it, they would try all sorts, or any manufacturer, they tried all sorts of configurations to try and work out where it lies. And that's all going to depend on the Pirellis. But yeah, coming back to Jorge Martin, I think Yamaha would, if he's looking outside. We imagine that he would want to keep factory status. I don't know. Yeah. Or would he say, you know what, I've tried it. He wanted it for so long, didn't he? And let's face it, it's been a bit of a nightmare so far. So maybe he'd say, you know what, I was quite happy being a satellite rider, and I have no problem with it if I'm on a factory spec bike. And he made history as the guy who won the world title. So would he go back to that again? I don't know. It's a difficult one, but certainly I think, on your question of Honda, they would not have appreciated being publicly named by Martin's manager as an option, when it was quite clear that, and Cabello Espeleta made clear that you've got to sort out the contract first. You've got to sort out your Aprilia situation first, either in court or amicably, before you do anything else. And at the same time, we kept hearing this, Honda's an option coming up, being name-checked, live on TV and things like that. I don't think that would have worked in Martin's favour as far as the future. Exactly how much that would matter, I don't know. Again, it all depends on how Martin performs at the start of next year and everything else. We're all assuming, of course, that Honda will be one of the bikes to be on, because they do have such a big budget. But of course, when the 800s came in, that first Honda wasn't a great bike. They dropped a long way back from dominating the 990s, really, didn't they, in terms of the machinery? Obviously, Rossi won the last titles on the Yamaha, but as far as the machinery, the Honda was the dominant force in 990s. They dropped behind Ducati significantly during the start or that first year of the 800s. They did make up ground quite quickly. Maybe that's also something you look at. You just accept that, look, it's going to be almost random, but who in the past has shown they can catch up the quickest? Who took, how long did it take for a manufacturer to win with a new bike? All these kind of things in new tyres. Who sort of adapted the quickest? Because I think it's just going to be so hard. I think Quartararo said this, to pick who's going to be the fastest straight away. I mean, it really, you just almost pick a name out of the hat, I suppose.
Yeah, I think didn't take Honda till the last year of the 800s to win the title, wasn't it? And 11 was Stoner, so it took them that long. And it's like they're Honda, of course, and they win races, Lewis. But I suppose you can factor in, we can not say Pecco's going to go to Honda, but you can bring him into this too with, say, he doesn't get on with whatever Ducati bring for 26 and he has to look at other avenues. He's in a similar position with Martin where, who does he commit to? Does he just kind of swallow his pride and go, oh, I'll happily just stay at Ducati sort of thing? Or does he want to take the risk?
I guess it depends very early, kind of into the first few races of next year, is have Ducati been able to figure out, and has he been able to figure out what was wrong this year? I think if yes, then I think Pecco Bagnaia stays a Ducati rider. Pecco's one of those riders I think that has probably a little bit more time to decide his future than anyone else, because he's unlikely to be at the top of the big name rider list. When we're talking about Fabio Quartararo, Digi, or Acosta, or even Mark, those types of riders are unlikely to be right up there, given what we saw last year, and given the fact he didn't win the championship the year before either. So, that doesn't tell the full story of 2024, but still, you look at very much, these things are looked at in a very short time frame. It's very much what you did recently rather than what you did before. And Pecco under-delivered this year on the Ducati. So if that carries on into the start of next year, I think Ducati would find it hard to justify a contract again with Pecco that wasn't very, very unfavourable for him. But then his options beyond that are not very good. This Yamaha link comes up, but realistically, unless you take a satellite ride somewhere else, and a lot of people have made the VR46 thing kind of comparison, the problem's not the team. The problem has been the bike, and and as you've said, Jordan, everyone's going to start on the same
machinery,
same bike in 27. So if that then doesn't work out, it doesn't matter if he's at VR46. It's still a Ducati. So I find it hard to think that we would see 2 years in a row of this performance from Pecco Bagnaia. I cannot see how Ducati and Pecco don't figure this out. However, if they don't, it does leave his options limited. I think, Honda clearly has its eyes elsewhere. Aprilia is a big player at this point and will have its eyes elsewhere. We know Bez obviously is the number one priority, and it's hard to see him not going anywhere. But I think Aprilia would probably fancy its chances of having a real big hitter to rider factory team lineup in 2027, given the form it's achieved now. And I'm not certain those plans involve Jorge Martin, even if he does pick up, just for all the reasons that you guys have said, is just what's happened there. And and it's worth remembering as well that Martin did have a Yamaha option a couple of years ago before he committed to Pramac Ducati. So there has been that link before. I think, Pecco, if he does leave Ducati, his options,
Aprilia potentially.
If Aprilia can't get someone bigger than that, to partner Bez, or they just simply don't have the money and Pecco hasn't done enough to justify a bigger contract. Maybe KCM if Acosta goes, there's maybe Yamaha, but then does Pecco think he's better than that? which, if Yamaha doesn't make any real sort of gains next year, even on a V4, does Pecco think, well, just because I've had a couple of difficult years doesn't mean I am, I deserve a poor bike. So yeah, maybe KTM. I think if KTM does lose Pedro Acosta, they'll want a reasonably big name to replace him, and I think Pecco's not a bad option from that front. In theory, the KTM would be an all right option if the characteristics of the bike stayed the same for Pecco. It's hard to tell, but Pecco's future is very much dependent on how he hits the ground running. Basically, next year, if he wants to stay at Ducati, then you're looking at the first tests, first couple of races to see where he's at, and then take it from there. And given what happened this year and at the start of this year, that would be an easier thing to tell if he has made a step forward, because it wasn't a great start to last year either. He was very far off the pace. So if he has made a step, we will see that quite quickly, I think. And I think that's really what's going to hinge on Pecco remaining as a Ducati rider. It won't be on the same kind of terms that he's enjoyed this current contract. But if the bike remains competitive and he's seen obviously what GG can do, I think Pecco would be quite happy to accept, whatever terms Ducati give him, if it just means staying on a bike that he's competitive on.
Yeah, it's fascinating because nothing's even happened there. We could completely off the mark. It could all kind of really stay the same. Who knows? In some alternate universe, there could just really not be many changes for 27. I'm not even factoring in Moto2. Say someone comes up, say someone who's amazing in Moto2 in 26, and looking at Holgado, Alonso, say they blow everyone out the water next year, and teams are going to go, well, they're on Pirellis. Why not give them as a go? That's the factor you're looking at, isn't it? I
was going to say the Pirelli factor there does lend itself to there being more Moto2 options there for teams. The other thing as well, as Pete mentioned on this, nobody's signed up for 27 yet. We don't really fundamentally know what satellite teams
are
going to look like.
True.
There has been rumours about Tech 3 moving away from KTM. Yeah. KTM has said that it has had conversations with other satellite teams. We know obviously LCR Honda's going to stay the same, that's fine. Pramac Yamaha will stay the same, that's fine. But beyond that, we don't know. We think Gresini hard to see Gresini not carrying on, but VR46 has been linked away with Ducati for a while. That could still happen. We don't know what's going to happen, with some of the others. So we don't fundamentally know that side of it as well. And I think because of those factors, because of the Pirelli factor, because teams might look at superbikes, and there's a couple of young riders there that would happily come back on low money. And even some bigger names, like Miguel Oliveira, for example, I don't think the door is fully shut on him. If he gels with the Pirellis this year on the BMW, a team would look at that and go, okay, we could find you a spot somewhere in one of our satellite teams. That's, you look at Pramac again, maybe, would that come back around? Maybe someone like Trackhouse, for example, needs, we need to see what Ralph Fernandez and Ayagura do. But, in theory, Ayagura should maybe be a bit more valuable with his Pirelli experience if he doesn't necessarily take the step forward in terms of results that we need to see from this year. There's those things, and I think we are going to get to a point where we are going to see a few reasonably big names currently on the grid missing out.
Absolutely.
There are going to be some riders out there that you'd have thought that have some good race winning potential and proven race winners, multiple race winners, that are probably going to find themselves without a full-time ride in 2027 because of all these factors. And I'm looking at people like Maverick Vinales, like Enea Bastianini, like these types of riders, those, good race winning names that have hit some struggles for one reason or another, are getting on a bit, have had a good few years now. Jack Miller, it's hard to see him sticking around, even with his V4 experience. I don't think that's going to carry over. That's going to hold him out much longer unless he starts producing results. Franco Morbidelli, Digi as well, wasn't super impressive this year. There are going to be, I think, some pretty big names that are going to miss out from that point as well. So that's going to be the other interesting thing, is that if there is such a demand for big name riders, and there are maybe some of them are going to be willing to take satellite rides with satellite teams, not necessarily with factory contracts, some space is going to have to be made, and I think once the music stops, there's going to be some big shocks amongst that who've missed out.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of egos that are going to be hit, aren't there, Pete? I think people are going to have a real reality check next year. And final thing for you, Pete, give me out of all the names that we've discussed, who do you think will be the rider to make the move first?
Just before I do that, I'll follow up what Lewis was saying there about people swapping championships. Let's remember, World Superbike Championship is going to Michelin.
Going to
so
Michelin.
If you are a MotoGP rider, a big name rider who fancies making the move across, I mean, it could work both ways. You know, we've said about people going Pirelli-wise. Yeah. So yeah, it'd be the perfect time if you're thinking to start a second career in Superbike, wouldn't it? Who's most likely to make the move early? Of the riders we mentioned, I think Quartararo. I think that the Sepang test is going to be massive for him, pre-season testing. I think he's going to want to see, you know, we're hearing that this will be the real V4 will arrive for the Sepang test, won't it? We've had, let's say, the lab bike, the prototype, the sort of restricted engine output, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And now kind of all the pieces will go together, bespoke chassis, aero, you know, suited to the V4. And I think that's going to be, you know, that's what he's going to want to need. And then it gets interesting, because what happens if it does take a big step? How long then does he give it when, you know, it's almost easier if it's a clearer choice of, well, look, it's still a long way behind and then he can make a move. But what if it makes a big step? How long do you give it then and risk losing out on, as we've said, maybe only one ride in each factory team? So, yeah, it's going to be, I think pre-season testing is going to be, as Quartararo himself has said, Sepang is the big one.
Yeah, can't wait for it. Like I say, I haven't even seen a race in 2026 yet, and I'm looking forward to 27 already. Just the nature of MotoGP and how it is. But yeah, let us know what you think in the comments. Who do you think will be the rider that will kind of trigger the dominoes to fall? Like I say, Marc Marquez is probably going to stay at Ducati, and that'll be, I mean, we're expecting that, but in behind him, it's going to be so fascinating, and I can't wait to see how everything shapes up by the midway point of next season in 26. That'll be real fun to look at and see who's on the table and who's not. But yeah, if you enjoyed this episode, like, subscribe, and comment on YouTube. Acast on Apple and Spotify if you're listening. Hit the wee bell icon so you never miss an episode. And yeah, we'll see you next week. We're going to get round to grading every rider. And that'll be fun. But that is next week's episode, and it'll be a long one. So yeah, make sure to come back and watch or listen to that. But yeah, see you then. Take care.